The air inside the airplane felt thick and heavy, not just with the recycled breath of hundreds of passengers, but with frustration. Flight 347 to Denver was already an hour behind schedule, and the gate agent's mumbled apologies did little to ease the growing tension. Every seat was occupied, and the overhead bins were crammed with carry-ons that people had desperately shoved in, hoping to avoid baggage fees. Babies cried, restless children kicked the seats in front of them, and the low hum of the aircraft's engines seemed to vibrate with everyone's collective impatience. In seat 22B sat Eleanor, a woman who believed the world revolved around her schedule. Dressed in a crisp, tailored suit and sporting a designer handbag, she radiated an air of importance. The delay was an unacceptable inconvenience, and she made sure everyone within earshot knew it, sighing dramatically and tapping her manicured nails on the armrest. She adjusted her expensive sunglasses, peering down her nose at the other passengers. Across the aisle, in seat 22A, sat an elderly man. He was the opposite of Eleanor in every way. Dressed in simple, worn clothing, a faded flannel shirt and comfortable slacks, he seemed almost invisible. His face was lined with wrinkles that spoke of a life well lived, and his eyes held a quiet sadness. He clutched a small, worn leather bag in his lap and stared out the window, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around him. He had boarded early, hoping to secure a window seat, and had settled in quietly, not wanting to cause any trouble. He didn't complain about the delay, nor did he fidget or fuss. He just sat there, a picture of patient resignation. The contrast between the two passengers was stark, a silent prelude to the drama that was about to unfold. The stale, recirculated air hung heavy as everyone waited, unaware that a simple seating arrangement was about to ignite a conflict. Eleanor's patience, already stretched thin, snapped. She glared at the old man, her eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses. The fact that he seemed so calm and unbothered only fueled her irritation. She cleared her throat loudly, but he didn't seem to notice. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and demanding. The old man blinked, startled, and turned to face her. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice soft and a little raspy. "Your seat," Eleanor said, gesturing dismissively. "It's encroaching. I need more space." The old man looked confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." He glanced down at his legs, as if checking to see if they were somehow overflowing into her designated area. "You're taking up too much room," Eleanor snapped, her voice rising in volume. "I paid for the seat and I expect to be comfortable. You need to move." He looked around, his face flushed slightly. "But this is my assigned seat." "I don't care about your assigned seat," Eleanor retorted, rolling her eyes. "I'm cramped here. Just move. Find another seat or stand, I don't care. Just get out of my way." Her words were laced with disdain, and several nearby passengers began to stare. The old man hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also didn't understand why he was being asked to move. He had carefully followed all the instructions, found his seat, and settled in quietly. He hadn't done anything wrong. I don't know where I would go," he stammered. "The plane is full." "That's not my problem," Eleanor said coldly. "Figure it out. I'm not spending this entire flight feeling like I'm being squeezed into a sardine can because of you." She crossed her arms and glared at him, her expression daring him to defy her. The air crackled with tension, and the other passengers held their breath, wondering what would happen next. Eleanor's rudeness was palpable, a thick cloud of entitlement that hung in the small space between their seats. The old man's shoulders slumped. He looked around at the other passengers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disapproval directed at Eleanor. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he also felt a deep sense of injustice. He had paid for his ticket, just like everyone else. Why should he be forced to give up his seat? But Eleanor's unwavering glare was intimidating. He could see the impatience radiating from her, the expectation that he would simply comply. He sighed, a small, defeated sound that barely registered above the hum of the airplane. "All right," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "I'll move." He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and gathered his small leather bag. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if each action required a great deal of effort. As he stood up, he bumped his head slightly on the overhead compartment, wincing in pain. Eleanor watched him with a smug expression, offering no assistance. The other passengers, however, felt a surge of sympathy for the old man. A young woman across the aisle frowned at Eleanor, shaking her head slightly. A businessman in the row behind muttered something under his breath about entitled people. The old man shuffled out into the aisle, his head bowed. He looked lost and vulnerable, like a small boat adrift at sea. He didn't know where to go, as Eleanor had pointed out, the plane was completely full. He started to walk slowly towards the back of the plane, hoping to find an empty seat or perhaps a sympathetic flight attendant who could help him. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. He wasn't used to being treated this way. He had always been a kind and respectful person, and he didn't understand why this woman was being so cruel to him. The embarrassment stung, a hot flush creeping up his neck. He just wanted to get to Denver to see his grandchildren, but now the journey had been tainted by this unpleasant encounter. The other passengers watched him go, feeling a collective sense of unease and guilt. They wished they could do something to help, but they were unsure of what to say or do. Eleanor, oblivious to the discomfort she had caused, settled back into her seat, a self-satisfied smirk on her face. As the old man slowly made his way down the aisle, his head bowed and his leather bag clutched tightly in his hand, a flight attendant named Sarah noticed the unusual activity. She had been assisting passengers with their carry-ons at the front of the plane when she saw the elderly man shuffling past, looking distressed. The atmosphere near seats 22A and 22B felt charged with unspoken tension, and she knew something was amiss. Approaching Eleanor, who was now comfortably settled in with a magazine, Sarah politely inquired, "Excuse me, ma'am, is everything all right here? I saw the gentleman leave his seat." Eleanor looked up, her eyes narrowing at Sarah. "Everything is perfectly fine," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "He was simply occupying too much space. I asked him to move, and he did." Sarah frowned, sensing that there was more to the story than Eleanor was letting on. "But sir, the flight is completely full. I don't believe there are any other available seats." "That is not my concern," Eleanor snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "Perhaps you should focus on your job and ensure that we take off on time instead of interfering in matters that don't concern you." Her tone was sharp and dismissive, leaving no room for further discussion. Sarah, taken aback by Eleanor's rudeness, hesitated for a moment. She wanted to help the old man, but she also didn't want to escalate the situation or cause further disruption. She glanced down the aisle, seeing the old man standing awkwardly near the restrooms, looking lost and confused. "Very well, ma'am," Sarah said, forcing a polite smile. "If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." She turned and walked towards the back of the plane, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't simply ignore the situation. The old man clearly needed assistance, and she felt a responsibility to help him. She decided to speak with the pilot, hoping he might have a solution. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned to her magazine, completely unconcerned about the distress she had caused. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, feeling a sense of satisfaction at having gotten her way. Sarah knocked gently on the cockpit door and stepped inside. Captain Miller, a seasoned pilot with years of experience, looked up from his pre-flight checklist. His expression was neutral, a mask of calm professionalism. "Everything all right, Sarah?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Not exactly, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice low. "There's been a bit of an incident back in coach. An elderly gentleman was asked to move from his seat, and now he has nowhere to sit. The woman who asked him to move was quite rude and wouldn't listen to reason." Captain Miller listened intently as Sarah recounted the events that had transpired between Eleanor and the old man. He frowned slightly, his expression beginning to shift from neutral to concerned. He disliked any situation that caused discomfort or distress to his passengers, especially when it seemed unjust. "Did you say an elderly gentleman?" Captain Miller asked, his brow furrowed. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "He's standing near the restrooms looking quite lost. I tried to intervene, but the woman wouldn't hear it." As Sarah continued to describe the old man, his simple clothes, his quiet demeanor, the worn leather bag he carried, a flicker of recognition crossed Captain Miller's face. He paused, thinking for a moment, his eyes focused on some distant memory. "And the woman who asked him to move?" he asked, his voice now tinged with a hint of urgency. "What did she look like?" Sarah described Eleanor, her expensive suit, her designer handbag, her sunglasses, and her overall air of entitlement. As she spoke, Captain Miller's expression hardened. The neutral mask had completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound seriousness. He leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "I'll handle this." He turned to his co-pilot and briefly explained the situation, then unbuckled his seatbelt. "I need to speak with these passengers myself." The co-pilot nodded in understanding, his own expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. Captain Miller stood up, his tall frame filling the small cockpit. He adjusted his uniform, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He wasn't just a pilot anymore, he was a man about to right a wrong. The engines of Flight 347 roared to life, signaling the imminent departure. The plane began to taxi slowly down the runway, picking up speed. Passengers braced themselves for takeoff, their anticipation building. Eleanor closed her eyes, relieved that the ordeal was almost over. The old man remained standing near the restrooms, feeling increasingly uncomfortable and out of place. He clutched his bag tightly, his heart heavy. Just as the pilot was about to give the signal for full throttle, the engines suddenly quieted. A collective groan rippled through the cabin. The plane slowed to a stop and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Good morning, everyone," Captain Miller announced, his tone professional but firm. "This is your captain speaking. We're going to experience a slight delay before takeoff. I need to speak with a passenger regarding a matter that has come to my attention. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause." A murmur of confusion and annoyance spread throughout the cabin. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what was happening. Eleanor opened her eyes, a frown creasing her forehead. She couldn't believe there was another delay. This trip was turning into a complete disaster. The old man, standing at the back of the plane, felt a surge of anxiety. He wondered if the delay had anything to do with him. Had he done something wrong? He gripped his bag even tighter, his knuckles turning white. Captain Miller's announcement hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Everyone on board was now acutely aware that something unusual was happening. The delay was unexpected and unexplained, adding to the growing tension. The plane sat motionless on the runway, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the auxiliary power unit. All eyes were fixed on the front of the plane, wondering what the captain was going to do. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. The flight, already delayed and fraught with tension, was about to take an unexpected turn. Captain Miller emerged from the cockpit, his presence immediately commanding attention. He walked down the aisle with a purposeful stride, his gaze sweeping over the rows of seated passengers. A hush fell over the cabin as everyone watched him approach. He moved with a quiet authority, his uniform crisp and his demeanor serious. He stopped in front of the old man, who stood near the restrooms, looking bewildered and slightly frightened. Captain Miller's expression softened as he looked at the elderly gentleman. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, and addressed the old man with a voice that resonated with respect. "Excuse me, sir," Captain Miller said, his voice clear and strong, easily heard throughout the cabin. "Are you General Howard?" The old man blinked in surprise, his eyes widening. He seemed taken aback by the pilot's question and the formal way he was being addressed. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I am." A collective gasp went through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks to get a better look at the old man, their eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Eleanor, who had been impatiently tapping her foot, suddenly sat up straight, her eyes wide with astonishment. She couldn't believe that the humble, unassuming man she had treated so rudely was actually a general. Captain Miller continued to address the old man, his voice filled with genuine respect. "General Howard, it is an honor to have you on our flight. I was informed of a situation that occurred earlier, and I wanted to personally ensure that you are comfortable and well taken care of." He paused, then added, "Your service to our country is deeply appreciated, sir." The other passengers were stunned into silence, completely captivated by the scene unfolding before them. The air crackled with a newfound respect and admiration for the elderly man who had been so easily dismissed just moments before. The entire dynamic of the flight had shifted, and Eleanor's earlier behavior now seemed even more appalling in light of the general's identity. Captain Miller turned to address the rest of the passengers, his voice resonating with sincerity and respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I want to take a moment to introduce you to someone very special. This is General Howard, a highly decorated war hero who has served our country with extraordinary bravery and distinction." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The passengers listened intently, their eyes fixed on the general, who stood humbly by the restrooms, looking slightly embarrassed by the attention. "General Howard has dedicated his life to protecting our freedoms," Captain Miller continued, his voice filled with emotion. "He has fought in countless battles and has received numerous awards for his courage and selflessness. He is a true American hero, and we are incredibly fortunate to have him on board with us today." A wave of emotion washed over the cabin. Passengers began to realize the magnitude of the general's service and sacrifice. They looked at him with newfound admiration and respect, their earlier impatience and annoyance replaced by a sense of gratitude. Captain Miller then did something that surprised everyone. He stood at attention, his back ramrod straight, and saluted General Howard. The crisp snap of his salute echoed through the silent cabin. "Thank you for your service, General," Captain Miller said, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "It is an honor to have you with us." The passengers were deeply moved by the pilot's gesture. They understood that Captain Miller was not just acknowledging the general's rank, but also his unwavering commitment to his country. The salute was a symbol of gratitude, respect, and admiration for a man who had given so much. Eleanor, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and embarrassment, finally understood the gravity of her actions. She realized that she had not just been rude to an elderly man, but to a national hero who deserved the utmost respect. A wave of shame washed over her, and she lowered her head, unable to meet the general's gaze. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. The air was now thick with respect, admiration, and a profound sense of gratitude for the quiet, unassuming man who had served his country so bravely. The realization of what had transpired washed over the passengers like a tidal wave. They were shocked and ashamed of Eleanor's behavior, recognizing the immense disrespect she had shown to a true American hero. The collective guilt and remorse were palpable, filling the cabin with a heavy silence for a brief moment. Then, as if on cue, a ripple of applause began, slowly building into a thunderous ovation. Passengers stood up, clapping their hands and cheering for General Howard. They were expressing their gratitude, their admiration, and their deep regret for allowing him to be treated so poorly. "Thank you for your service, General," someone shouted from the back of the plane. "We appreciate everything you've done for us," another passenger added. The applause continued, a wave of appreciation washing over the general. He stood there, looking humbled and slightly overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. A faint smile touched his lips, and he nodded his head in acknowledgement. Eleanor, meanwhile, had shrunk down in her seat, feeling smaller and more insignificant than she had ever felt in her life. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, crushing her sense of entitlement. She couldn't meet anyone's gaze, her face flushed with embarrassment and shame. She wished she could disappear, to rewind time and undo her appalling behavior. The applause seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of her rudeness and insensitivity. She had initially sought comfort and space, but now she felt utterly alone, isolated by her own actions. The designer handbag that had once been a symbol of her status now felt like a heavy burden. The expensive suit that had made her feel so important now seemed like a costume, revealing her true nature beneath. As the applause continued, Eleanor remained huddled in her seat, a stark contrast to the general who was being celebrated for his bravery and selflessness. The passengers' admiration for the general only amplified her shame, turning her earlier smugness into a deep and abiding sense of remorse. The flight, once defined by her impatience and entitlement, was now a powerful lesson in humility and respect. As the applause began to subside, Captain Miller addressed General Howard once more, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "General," he said, "I would like to offer you a seat in first class. It would be an honor to have you as our guest up front, where you can travel in greater comfort." The passengers murmured in agreement, their eyes filled with anticipation. They felt that the general deserved the very best after the way he had been treated. General Howard smiled gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He appreciated the gesture, but he was also a man of simple needs. "Thank you, Captain," he replied, his voice soft but clear. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm quite comfortable here. I don't want to cause any more trouble." Captain Miller looked surprised. "But General, after everything that's happened." "It's all right, Captain," General Howard interjected, his voice firm but kind. "I just want to get home to my family. This seat is fine." His words touched the hearts of the passengers. They recognized his humility and his lack of entitlement. He wasn't seeking special treatment or recognition, he simply wanted to be with his loved ones. His selflessness only amplified their respect for him. "Are you sure, General?" Captain Miller asked, wanting to ensure that the general was truly comfortable. "Yes, Captain," General Howard replied with a smile. "Thank you again for your kindness." Captain Miller hesitated for a moment, then nodded in understanding. He respected the general's wishes, but he also felt that he couldn't simply let the matter drop. He had an idea, a way to ensure that the general received the comfort and respect he deserved, while also making a point to Eleanor about the importance of humility and kindness. The stage was set for one final act of justice and redemption. The flight, already filled with drama and emotion, was about to reach its climax. Captain Miller smiled warmly at General Howard. "General, with all due respect, I must insist," he said. It would be my honor, and I know the other passengers would agree if you would accept this small token of our appreciation. He turned to the passengers and gestured towards the front of the plane. What do you all think? Shouldn't General Howard be traveling in first class? A chorus of enthusiastic agreement erupted from the cabin. Yes, they shouted. He deserves it. Upgrade him. First class for the general. The passengers' encouragement was overwhelming. General Howard looked touched by their support, but he still seemed hesitant. I really don't want to cause any trouble, he said, his voice barely audible above the din. No trouble at all, General, Captain Miller assured him. In fact, it would be our pleasure. He winked at Sarah, who quickly began to prepare a first-class seat for the general. Seeing the genuine enthusiasm of the passengers and the sincere insistence of the pilot, General Howard finally relented. All right, he said with a smile. If you all insist, I'll accept. A cheer went up from the cabin. Passengers clapped and whistled, delighted that the general would finally be traveling in comfort. Captain Miller then turned his attention to Eleanor, who was still huddled in her seat, looking miserable. Ma'am, he said, his voice polite but firm, since General Howard has graciously accepted our offer, I'm afraid we'll need you to move back to his original seat. Eleanor's face paled. The humiliation was complete. She had gone from demanding more space to being forced to relinquish the seat she had so rudely claimed. She mumbled something inaudible and reluctantly gathered her belongings. With her head bowed, she made her way back to seat 22B, the seat she had so disdainfully dismissed just moments before. The other passengers watched her go, their expressions a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served. The general, meanwhile, was escorted to his new seat in first class, where he was greeted with warm smiles and sincere gratitude. The flight was finally ready for takeoff, but the events that had transpired would remain etched in the memories of all those on board. With General Howard settled comfortably in his first-class seat and Eleanor silently fuming in her cramped quarters in coach, Flight 347 finally began its ascent into the sky. The engines roared, the plane vibrated, and the passengers braced themselves for takeoff. As the wheels left the ground, a final, heartfelt round of applause erupted from the cabin. The passengers clapped and cheered, their voices filled with gratitude and admiration for the general. They were celebrating his service, his humility, and his quiet dignity. They were also celebrating the triumph of good over evil, the victory of respect over rudeness, and the power of kindness to transform even the most difficult situations. General Howard smiled warmly at the passengers, his eyes twinkling with gratitude. He raised his hand in a gesture of acknowledgement, then settled back in his seat, ready to enjoy the flight. He was grateful for the outpouring of support and respect, but he was also looking forward to seeing his family in Denver. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained silent, her head bowed and her face hidden from view. She had learned a valuable lesson about respect and humility, a lesson that had been delivered in the most public and humiliating way possible. She understood that true worth wasn't measured by wealth or status, but by character and kindness. She hoped that she could carry this lesson with her and that it would change the way she treated others in the future. As the plane soared through the clouds, the atmosphere in the cabin was transformed. The tension and frustration that had characterized the earlier part of the flight had been replaced by a sense of camaraderie and shared experience. The passengers had witnessed a remarkable event, a moment of justice and redemption that had brought them together. The grumpy woman, humbled and ashamed, had learned that even the simplest person can be a hero and that true greatness lies not in demanding respect, but in earning it through service and humility. And as Flight 347 continued its journey towards Denver, the passengers knew that they would never forget the day they flew with General Howard, the war hero who taught them all a valuable lesson about the importance of respect and kindness.